Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us here at the forums. Uh, Thank you so much for joining us here at the Forum Sustainable Development Impact Summit. My name is Ishan Tharoor. I'm a foreign affairs columnist at the Washington Post, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this event. Before we get started and before I introduce you to our wonderful panel, just a quick set of housekeeping notes. Um, I believe the way this forum is being conducted, for any participant or attendee to ask questions, you should go to slido.com. That's slido.com, and ask questions with the hashtag SDIS. I believe on your screens there should be visible now a QR code, which you can also use to access the forum by which you can ask questions to our panelists. And I think you can now see that QR code now on your screen. So the subject of our conversation today is a very weighty one, a new standard for social justice. We speak right now, of course, not long after the US passed a truly grim milestone of 200,000 coronavirus-related deaths. The global debt toll now is nearing 1 million and will eventually cross that soon. And of course, the pandemic's impact can't be measured in lives lost alone. We've seen economies ravaged, global hunger mount, countless numbers of people slide into poverty and lives of greater precariousness. Contrary to that old cliche about plagues, this virus has not been a great leveler. In the US, we've seen how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted the poor and communities of color. In other parts of the world, especially in the developing world, where hundreds of millions of people live and work in certain circumstances where social distancing is impossible, and in an informal economy where there's no safety net, we're seeing a situation that's not only a public health crisis, but a humanitarian one. Economies are entering recessions, jobs are vanishing, and safety nets simply do not exist for communities now faced with a almost vicious set of cascading calamities. Now, parallel to all this, and especially in the West, or at least in a transatlantic context, we saw a historic moment of protest earlier this summer following the death of George Floyd. And even as, especially here in the United States, as the political landscape looks bitterly divided, we've seen businesses and corporate leaders take the lead in amplifying calls for change and really focusing on the need for a meaningful conversation and action around diversity and greater inclusion. Sure, the pandemic is far from over, and here in the US, we're still reckoning with basically the first wave. But as we think about recovery, and this is of course a huge theme in our conversations here at the forum, it seems clear that questions of social justice have to be at that core of that response. So to help me navigate through all this and have our conversation, I'm really delighted to introduce a terrific panel. We're joined by Bo Young Lee, Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Uber Technologies. We're also joined by Laura Morgan Roberts, Professor of Practice at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. And I'm thrilled to also welcome Eddie Ndopu, an internationally acclaimed activist and humanitarian who's been named by the Secretary General as one of the advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals. Concluding the session, we'll also be joined with remarks from Sadia Zahidi, who heads the Forum's Project for a New Economy and Society. So thank you all very much for joining us. Good morning to all of you, or good afternoon to some of you. Bo, I'd love to start with you. I recently went by my office at the Washington Post, and a block away from our offices, there's a gigantic billboard in black that says, "If you tolerate racism, delete Uber." It's a pretty stark message. It's part of a huge campaign that Uber has launched, at least in the United States. What sort of impact has that had? And have you seen a lot of people deleting Uber as a result?
So we actually haven't. And I think the ad itself, when we decided to launch it and the campaign itself, we knew that it was going to be controversial. But we also know as a company that now is not the time for neutrality. And as you mentioned earlier, the greatest ally that COVID-19 has been socioeconomic disparity. In those societies, we've seen that when those societies that have the greatest levels of socioeconomic disparity, that's where we've seen COVID just having the greatest impact. And so from the very beginning, Uber has always led with a deep desire during the pandemic to lead with a deep desire for thinking about the community at large and what is the best thing for the community at large. So from the very beginning, you may recall, actually, we actually launched another campaign at the very beginning of the pandemic where we actually asked people not to move. You know, we had ads out there saying, even though our entire organization is about movement, it's about motion, it's about connecting people with each other, we said, don't move, it's not the time. Because as you know, the American physician, Dr. Anthony Fauci said, now is the time to care deeply about everyone else, to care deeply about our communities. And then as the pandemic developed, and as you mentioned, the tragic murder of George Floyd, we knew that we as a company couldn't stay neutral in those situations. And so whether it is communities of color, whether it is communities of, you know, the disability community, whether it's communities of caregivers, we know that COVID has been disproportionately impacting other, you know, each community differently. So whether it is our bold statements around anti-racism, earlier this summer, we came out with our statements really as a company that is building towards anti-racism, and we came out with a set of 16 different commitments towards that. Whether it is the policies that we've launched to support our caregivers. We know that caregivers have been so disproportionately impacted with schools closing, daycares closing, and we know that when caregivers suffer, oftentimes there's the extended suffering that women who disproportionately take roles in caregiving are impacted. So we came out with a policy that said we are going to offer enhanced flexibility to all of our caregivers throughout the course of this pandemic. And then another community that we've really been focusing on is the disability community, and particularly those individuals who are struggling with their mental health. From the very beginning of COVID, Uber has been sending out messages and launching new tools to support our communities. We've been encouraging our employees to speak to, you know, professionals within the mental health community. We've been, you know, offering them more time off, encouraging people to take their paid time off, because we really know that as a byproduct of COVID, there will be another crisis, a mental health crisis that ensues from this. And that's one way we've been supporting the disability community. Another way that we've really been trying, we've been launching new tools on our product, really focusing on delivering not just, you know, meals from restaurants, but also delivering groceries. We're starting to do some piloting around delivery of prescription drugs from drugstores, because we know that within the disability community, oftentimes there's a lot of immunosuppression. You know, I speak to the disability community often. They're oftentimes saying, we're just afraid of the outside world now. But how do we still stay engaged? So we're looking at our products from that perspective as well. And then, of course, we've done quite a bit from just a corporate social responsibility, donating millions of credits, both ride credits and meal credits, to essential workers, working with, you know, the National Health Services in UK and around the world to be able to support our communities that really need mobility during this period of time where, you know, mobility is sometimes quite, you know, dangerous and can lead to unfortunate consequences.
How do you respond to some of the skepticism that is aimed at major companies like yours about virtue signaling, about the fact that this is a kind of woke washing that many of these companies are doing, especially when you are at the heart of a new economy that is contingent on the labor of people who are independent contractors, who have been put in situations where their recourse and their safety nets don't fully exist in the same way as other people's do.
Absolutely. And I tell people all the time, like, don't believe us. Like, we welcome your skepticism, because that skepticism creates accountability. We know part of the reason why we wanted to come out with such a bold statement around anti-racism is because it was our way of saying to the world, we're committing to creating a more racially equitable environment, both within Uber, but also trying to help our communities also create that. We are being bold about making these statements because we want you to hold us accountable. That transparency of our commitment, it creates that accountability from a larger social perspective. And we're hyper aware of the fact that, you know, a lot of that skepticism comes from a perception of inequity in terms of how we might treat, you know, our larger partner network, you know, our driver partners, our couriers. But as you know, one of the things that we're trying to drive, for example, within California, is we're actually trying to create, we have a ballot initiative right now where we're trying to actually create a more just way for the freelance environment. Some of the restrictions in terms of how we support our driver partners is a byproduct of very arcane laws that say, you know, if you're going to have an independent contractor, you must treat them this way. We want to be able to maintain that flexibility that comes from allowing our driver partners to be, you know, independent contractors, yet at the same time offering them more support from a healthcare perspective and from offering them other benefits and services that right now are just not allowable within the current legal structure. So we know that we want to be able to offer our driver partners more, and that's part of our what we're trying to drive for as a pilot within California.
Even as you are pushing through these anti-racism messagings and really trying to take a pretty new role in terms of talking about a new society with greater diversity and inclusion, surely you are aware that there are studies and a great deal of commentary about how the nature of the gig economy is exacerbating inequities as well. And I think a lot of the driving impetus behind the ballot initiative that you're talking about and the people who are opposed to you fear that the world being created by the Ubers of the world is one where inequity is exacerbated.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you just have to look at who is supporting and, you know, our ballot initiative in California. So we've had, for example, the NAACP of California and Hawaii, who came out with an op-ed supporting, you know, Prop 22. We have massive support from the African American and the Latino communities, and we know that in part, you know, we have that support because if you look at, you know, the policy itself, you know, the places where AB5 has exemptions are largely those freelance positions that are dominated by white professions, right? And then the freelance opportunities that are predominantly you know, supported that are impacted by AB5 are those where Black and Latinx individuals are represented. So I think I think if you look at who is supporting, you know, the efforts of Uber, you will see that, you know, we are actually really trying to address that inequity that has been, you know, that has been created through changes in the way that we run our products, the way that we support our driver partners.
Thank you. I think this is a great moment to turn to Laura. We're seeing how companies like Uber are pivoting in this moment, really trying to grapple with the systemic issues that countries face, as well as their own imperatives in the corporate world. You study this in great depth. Talk us through the sorts of messaging that we're seeing now from companies, and you know, the way I talked about virtue signaling, is there something deeper to the virtue signaling, and how do you see through the arguments and criticisms over corporate virtue signaling?
I think there is something deeper to the virtue signaling, but it is rooted in two fundamental needs that humans have. And these needs both empower and obstruct social justice movements. There's a need to cultivate and sustain positive identities to present oneself and one's organization in a virtuous and righteous way. There's also a need for belongingness, to feel that one has a sense of place, a sense of community, and to some extent, a sense of power or a base of power. And those two things do go hand in hand. But at the root of injustice is a hypervigilant concern for the needs of the dominant group with respect to their positive identities and with respect to their belonging or sense of place. So we often build systems like work organizations in ways that placate the needs of the dominant group, often at the cost of or at the expense of the marginalized and oppressed. So our power dynamics are oriented toward radically affirming the egos of higher status actors. That's just how sort of social psychology and power and influence work. And so, as much as social change is necessary, we tend to avoid it or undermine it when it begins to destabilize the dominant group sense of place and ownership. So, does virtue signaling really push hard enough for people in positions of power to question and examine the ways in which their needs and their privilege is being centered in work on so-called justice? For instance, our institutional logics around diversity, equity, and inclusion have gained traction in different ways in different periods of time. 50 years ago, there was an emphasis on EEO, right, and affirmative action. Those in many ways were compliance-based, but in response to widespread grassroots civil rights movement, the likes of which we really haven't seen until the summer of 2020. But those initiatives began to be met with resistance. In the 1980s, we saw different moves to try to disparage and delegitimize the needs people who had been oppressed and isolated in organizations, just creating negative narratives around disproportionate priority, like the welfare mother. So we flipped the script. Our work evolved. Our DEI initiatives then said, okay, well, let's appeal to a different set of sentiments. Let's talk about global innovation. Let's talk about diversity in teams. Let's talk about the value and the importance of diversity of thought. All true, all true. But then morphed even further to erase race and many of the deepest chasms in equality, oppression, and injustice from the equation, with frames around belonging and welcoming and bringing our whole selves to work, which then, found resonance with young guys in Silicon Valley who dropped out of college, and they brought their whole selves to work by wearing t-shirts and, making billions. And that's all fantastic, but it wasn't really in the spirit of addressing the needs of the least of these, the people who are on the margin, the people who have been rewarded for compartmentalizing and suppressing their needs, those who have had to align their behaviors in support of the status quo, or conform, in other words, in order to advance within the organization. So the ways that we need to proceed at this point in terms of adopting a new set of standards and a new set of initiatives would be to center the experiences and engage in some radical affirmation around people who were at the margin, not to back off when those in power begin to feel that sense of discomfort, or they start to question whether or not their hopes and dreams for maximizing their potential can be achieved in the same ways as they were before. But to really shift our focus and emphasis this time in a meaningful way in helping people of all backgrounds to feel that they truly belong in their work organizations in the same way that we want them to feel they truly belong in their communities, in society, that they feel safe when they're in the workplace in the same way that we want them to feel safe as they're coming and going to work or to retail operations, or to not being pulled over, carded, culturally profiled because they don't look like they belong. They don't look legitimate. They're presumed to be the lowest status member of the occupational hierarchy, regardless of what their exact role may be, or they're assumed to be an intruder or a criminal, and then called on that. So just a lack of physical safety, but also psychological safety is essential in the work that we're doing going forward. And these are the kinds of stories that many leaders have to contend with now. After making public statements such as Black Lives Matter, we are in favor of anti-racism, we are against white supremacy and so forth. You know, some of the language is very, very strong, things we have not heard corporate leaders say prior to summer 2020. But then they're finding out that there are members of the organization who don't feel safe in the organization itself. Furthermore, they don't feel that their contributions are valued. They don't feel that their efforts are rewarded fairly. And they don't feel that they have the opportunities to maximize their full potential. Now, those are things that everybody would want in the context of work. But fundamentally, we see these discrepancies and disparities, not just in experiences, but also in outcomes when it comes to where Black and Brown people are positioned throughout our organization, the kinds of wealth that they accrue or are unable to accrue, which we know is fundamentally tied to what's happening in their workplace opportunities and reward systems. And then just their physical and psychological well-being as a consequence of what's happening. When we talk about COVID-19 and we talk about the essential workers, you know, we can't help but acknowledge that within that band of essential workers, the sad irony here is that the people who were on the front lines and fighting the pandemic in its most frightening and tragic ways were people of color. And within healthcare institutions, actually women of color constituting over 50% of those frontline service roles in healthcare institutions in the United States. So again, the shifting standard is to prioritize the equity, the inclusion, the belonging, and of course the justice for people who have been marginalized for generations, and to hold fast with that, not to back off when people in the dominant group begin to feel that their identities are threatened.
That's terrific. And could you possibly give us a sense of a few companies or places where this thinking has crystallized in a certain way, or and perhaps enunciate or just put on the table a few of these new standard practices that are actively in motion as far as you've seen in the corporate world?
Yes, I'm always hesitant to name drop corporations, and I just speak at the level of practices, and then I invite people to join me in the daily unfolding of social media, where we're hearing about a million different practices that companies are doing. We could talk about philanthropic efforts at Microsoft. We could talk about Uber and the way in which CEO compensation is tied to progress, or stock options, I think, for your CEO are tied to some diversity and inclusion initiatives. We could talk about some leading banks who are having learning circles among their board members. We could talk about the series of fireside chats, some private, some public, some which we became private and then were released to the public. And I participated in many of those over the summer, like BlackRock, MetLife, and so forth. So I think you see a lot of people trying to learn, and that's really important, trying to give, and giving in partnerships with key stakeholders like historically Black colleges and universities. For instance, the Netflix donation to Morehouse and Spelman is another example. And so I think those are two important pillars. When we start to talk about policy change or policy reform within the organization, really have to start reevaluating the systems that have reproduced inequality over time. And this is where organizations are far less transparent. So they'll tell you about those first two things, but what's going on internally, where they're starting to screen their hiring processes, where they're calling out the inequities. You know, when you list your core competencies or the criteria that you're stating to hire, you do a search, the search doesn't turn up the exact person you want. So then it turns into but hey, I know a guy. And the next thing you know, you've reproduced this internal network of hierarchy, and the people who were maybe people of color and had 8 out of the 10 boxes checked, but not all 10, they got weeded out in the first stage. So when it was time to loop back to the, hey, I know a guy, they weren't in that loop. So those are some of the conversations that fit into unconscious bias. There's also looking at performance evaluation, disparities, looking at the relative rates of advancement for people of color by race, gender, class, other dimensions of difference to see who's advancing more quickly within the organization and who less so. The last thing people are really curious about is accountability when people engage in discriminatory acts. Are managers being held accountable? We all know the story of Amy Cooper. Well, maybe we don't all know the story of Amy Cooper, but with Amy and Cooper and Christian Cooper and their interchange in Central Park, that was an incident in which Amy Cooper lost her job. There were other incidents where people were blasted on Twitter and other social media outlets for doing things out in public that demonstrated discriminatory and racist actions and beliefs. They lost their jobs, but what of the managers who are perpetuating these kinds of microaggressions on a daily basis? Are they given any coaching or performance feedback about that? Generally not. So the organizations that are really serious about this work are also starting to coach and hold their managers accountable for inclusive leadership competencies.
Thank you, Laura. Eddie, if I can turn to you now to perhaps globalize the discussion a bit as we talk about the impacts of the coronavirus, as we talk about the need to further reckon with the complexity of the recoveries and the inequities that we've seen that have been exposed by what's happening. How do you see things changing? How do you see the responsibility of both government as well as major philanthropic organizations, as well as corporations, in guiding a more sustainable and equitable recovery?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that the pandemic has really revealed a pretty stark conundrum facing leaders everywhere. And that is the fact that the same people that bear the worst manifestations of the pandemic happen to be the same people bearing the brunt of climate change. These are the same people that are grappling with racial inequality. Those are the same people that are going to be further plunged into extreme poverty as a result of the economic fallout of the pandemic. So what we're bearing witness to is that we have not done a good job at the global public policy level of being able to think intersectionally. The Sustainable Development Goals agenda is 17 goals, but it's an entire agenda. But people think about the goals in very compartmentalized terms, right? So I'm often asked, oh, Eddie, which goal are you advocating for? Are you with education, or are you with gender equality, or are you with SDG 10 on reduced inequalities? And I think implicit in that argument is a failure of imagination to recognize that people embody a multiplicity of experiences simultaneously. Therefore, the effects of oppression are likely to be compounded. So this is an invitation, I think, for global policymakers everywhere to reimagine the public policy approach. The way that we do policy is actually so far removed from the way that people experience the worst manifestations of global crises. And I think this is where thinking about the interconnections between the various goals becomes absolutely important. I think building on that, something that I've noticed, which is really fascinating, is that, the title for our conversation is A New Standard for Social Justice. When I think about standards, I can't help but think about thresholds and yardsticks and benchmarks, right? And it's baffling that, anywhere between 100 and 500 million people, depending on which estimates you look at, can be plunged into extreme poverty. What that says is that before the pandemic, people were already precarious. People were already vulnerable to the shocks of any crisis, whether we're talking about climate, whether we're speaking about health. And so what that says is that we have counted the wrong things. We have counted people moving from $1 a day to $3 a day. We have counted that as progress. And we have said that this is a good thing. We were celebrating beforehand. We said that so many millions of people are no longer living in extreme poverty. Well, guess what? Right now, that number has doubled. And so we need to be more ambitious in terms of what we count. These minimum thresholds that we've embraced when it comes to thinking about progress and thinking about equality actually don't provide the kind of resilience that the most impoverished communities in the world need in order to withstand the worst manifestations of any crisis. And then finally, I said, building on that point about thresholds, the other important thing to acknowledge is that the Sustainable Development Goals agenda seems to be always catching up to the moment. This time last year, I was in New York at the UN General Assembly, and I realized that the smallest plenary discussion was on health. Nobody was at the Universal Health Panel. Everybody was at climate change. And then months later, we find ourselves slap bang in the middle of a global health crisis. So the Sustainable Development Goals need to be setting the agenda rather than catching up to the moment, right? And so what that requires is that we really bridge the gap between social justice and the international development and international humanitarian framework.
Thank you, Eddie. I think I'd like to bring in some questions that have come in from the audience. And perhaps I can direct this to you, Eddie. The first question that's come in asks, doesn't the future of work, and I think this segues a bit into our thinking about climate change as well, doesn't the future of work need to be reconceived as future of working in order for human centricity to overcome corporate centricity? What do you make of that framing?
Absolutely. Well, I think what we call work has been fundamentally altered. I think our very conception of work no longer holds. And that is due to a multitude of factors, whether we're talking about the advent of the fourth industrial revolution. I think work and what we call work is already changing in a really fundamental way. And so I think we all need to be rethinking what we mean by that. I mean, even the fact that we are here now speaking virtually, all of these things blur the demarcations that we've held in place. Where does work begin? Where does work end? What is the work hour? What does this mean transnationally? So all of these questions, I think, throw into stark relief the fact that we are so unprepared for a world of work. And what does it mean when right now so many communities are likely to be out of work permanently, even though we are all working remotely, right? So there's so many questions that I think are up for discussion. And I do think it is a question of working, but also I think sociologically, what does that mean in the context of dignity? What does that mean in our conception of self? Who are we as human beings in the absence of a kind of rigid conceptualization of work? And so I think all of these questions are going to become absolutely imperative as we move into this sort of post-COVID new normal world in which we live.
And I think these are, of course, conversations that are going to be dominating our discussions at the World Economic Forum and other places in the months and years to come. And this is very much part of how we conceive of this great reset, as the forum has been discussing. There are a couple of other questions. I'd love to bring Bo and Laura back into this as well. I think, Bo, maybe let's toss this to you. I mean, from Parvati Santosh Kumar of the Global Shapers community, what actions by business and government would shift power to Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and communities of color? I'm sure, of course, I mean, Uber has very dramatically set a set of benchmarks for itself. Could you talk a bit more about what you guys are doing and how that can translate into more meaningful change elsewhere as well?
Absolutely, and that it actually goes to the question that's right above it as well. I think one of the biggest challenges to that empowerment of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, communities of color, people of color, is simply that if you still go into corporations today, the top two layers are predominantly white, right? And so when you're having these conversations around dismantling, white supremacy, the thing you have to realize is those conversations are being had with people who benefit from the systems that, support like white supremacy culture, white supremacy behavior, and fundamentally they're very threatening. And so I keep saying, like, the way that you transform, and shift that is to actually, any way you can bring those communities into your organization, but not just at the bottom levels. You have to bring them at the top levels. You have to, so that when you're having conversations of white culture, of white supremacy, that the people you're having it with aren't people who benefit from those systems of supremacy, right? When you have voices where at the table, at the leadership table, then the organization changes, because it's not enough to just bring that representation in. You bring the representation in to the organization because you have to bring in people who are actually inspired to change the culture, inspired to change those supremacist ideas, right? Part of what I keep saying is, if you're gonna if Silicon Valley is gonna mint like millionaires, on the regular, I want those millionaires to be Black. I want them to be Latinx. I want them to be Indigenous, because that money, when it goes into the hands of people who are Black, Latinx, and Indigenous, goes into the community differently. It's used for different purposes, right? So one of the simplest things, and the reason why we've built accountability in Uber, and we've expanded that accountability beyond our CEO, right? We've expanded it to all of our leadership, is because we want something measurable. We're like, it's not enough to just virtue signal. We want progress to impact you as well. So that is the number one easiest. It's not easy. I shouldn't say it's easy. It's very, very difficult, because I've been doing this work for 18 years, and we are still sadly having the same conversation that we had when I first started 18 years ago. It's not easy. It takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of confrontation about how some of us benefit from systems of colorism and lightness, right? So that's where it begins. That's how you start.
We are running out of time, and there are questions streaming in. So Laura, could I direct another one that's somewhat related and perhaps a bit more sharply framed to you from Mariel Muller? Can we truly advance the Black community to more leadership without current, as in white, leaders stepping back?
That's a great question. I have two thoughts, immediate responses to that. The first is just a reminder of what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said when questioned about when there would be enough women on the Supreme Court for her to be satisfied. And her response was, when there are 9. And I think it was just, a shift frame that speaks for itself. Representation is a starting point and an ending point. When you add more people of color, when you add more Black people in leadership positions, they change the culture. When the culture changes, they also make different business decisions. Those attract more talented people of all backgrounds. That also means it attracts more Black people. So that is essential as part of the cycle of change. The second piece of this question is white leaders stepping back. Stepping back can be metaphorical. Stepping back is also concrete. Stepping back means not trying to get all of the credit for whatever progress has taken place. Framing yourself in the narrative in a way that doesn't overtake or overshadow the leadership and the work that the Black community has catalyzed and executed and sacrificed for many, many years. Stepping back can, though, be concrete. It can be Alexis Ohanian giving up his own seat on the board of his company so that it would go to another Black person, because, like the Supreme Court, there are many leadership roles where there's a concrete number at present of people who can be in those particular roles. And unless you're going to expand the leadership suite, which you can't do that infinitely, there has to be some movement. And that means that some people who are either there, by merit or they're, by grace and bonus, are going to have to move and shift within the system so that the Black community and other people who have been on the margins and who have been oppressed can get the same access.
Terrific. I think in the few minutes we have now left, I'd love to bring in Sadia Zahidi, of the Forum Center for a New Society and Economy. Sadia, please respond to what you've heard and help us understand, situate this in the ongoing discussions we're having right now here at the Forum.
Great, thank you, Ishan. Thanks for the great moderation, and thanks to Eddie, Laura, and Bo for your contributions. I think we've had such a rich conversation, and we've only barely scratched the surface of what we needed to discuss. And that is why the New Economy and Society platform at the Forum is providing this ongoing approach so that we can start addressing the questions of economic and social justice that have been raised today. And the way we think that can be done is, one, let's look at that big macro picture. What does economic growth and revival need to look like today in this new context that we've reached? How do we make it more green and inclusive as we do head back towards growth, so we're not stuck with the systems of the past? Two, to the point that was raised in the conversation, what does work and wages and job creation need to look like in the future? What is the meaning of this new world of work? Many of us would say that the future of work has to some extent arrived. Yes, the format of work has changed, but has the fundamental nature of what we value in work and the identity it gives people, has that actually changed, and how do we make that happen? Third, transforming education, skills, and learning. There is a huge reskilling and upskilling revolution that needs to be occurring if we want to ensure people are set up for the jobs and the values of tomorrow. And then the fourth area is around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ensuring that we have the right kind of representation, inclusion, and equity. So to make all of that work, there's sort of three types of things we're trying to do. One, to Eddie's point, create better measures, more relevant measures than what we have currently, because we have been measuring the wrong stuff. Two, create better standards. And I think part of today's conversation started addressing that, but there are a number of different venues in which we're doing that. We're working with a group that's focused specifically on bringing together chief diversity and inclusion officers, a group that's looking specifically at disability inclusion, a group that's looking specifically at LGBTI inclusion, but then also putting that together in this holistic framework around equity and social justice. And then finally, faster and better action. And again, there are a number of businesses and governments that are coming together that are working on all of the things that fall within the umbrella of social justice. I'd like to invite you to continue this conversation, particularly at what we call the Jobs Reset Summit, which will be taking place from the 20th to the 23rd of October. And we'll take these four pillars and actually see, how do we break this down so that everybody has opportunity in the future and it doesn't remain limited to a few people in certain parts of the globe. Thank you very much. Back to you, Ishan.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Sadia, and really thank you, Laura, Bo, and Eddie, for a really interesting conversation. Yes, we just only scratched the surface, but I'm sure there'll be much more scratching to come in the days ahead. And I look forward to having these conversations in other forums. And I really encourage you all and all the participants to keep attending the events this week at the Forum, virtually, of course. And thank you again. Thank you very much to the panelists. And thank you to the Forum for allowing me a chance to preside over a very fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.